Good morning. First of all, today is 13th of Kislev, which is my grandfather's yahrzeit, my mother's father. So we dedicate the class in his memory today. Rabbi Shaya Arya ben Menashe, who invested lots of time, money, and effort into this institution. He took a lot of nachas in this institution. His two children built it, my mother and my uncle, and their spouses, my father and my aunt. And so I'm sure he continues to have that nachas, and I'm sure he continues to invest from his place. Okay, so where are we? So this week is going to be somewhat of a repetition from last week, actually, and I mentioned this last week, that the author wrote two versions of this text, especially this chapter, and the next chapter, chapter 5. So we're reading the old version now, and then we're going to read the new version. So it'll end up being quite a bit of repetition. But as I mentioned last week, the final point that we started talking about last week is going to be reiterated in the part 2 with much more words, much more language, and much more explanation. Whereas in part 1, at least from what we read now, we kind of just got the essence of it, just like the facts of it, but didn't really give much language for that yet. And what is that? Essentially like this. So we've come to this point. We're starting to fine-tune the relationship between the infinite and the finite, that which is beyond definition, Hashem as He is beyond definition, the Maharal, which described God as no definition whatsoever, versus God as a more invested and defined, as we say in our prayers, you're kind, you're wise, you're etc., which was, let's say, parallel to Rambam, who described God as being one with His knowledge, because He and His knowledge are all one, as God being a knowing being, and yet that knowledge doesn't contradict His oneness because He's one with His knowledge, as the Rambam explained. Right? So we're trying to fine-tune the connection between these two things, and what we left with was, using the analogy of light and vessels, that was the Kabbalistic introduction, that the light remains translucent, remains non-defined, even though it is the one that's bringing you all the color. So even though the light brings all the color, because it interacts with vessels, the light interacts with the table, with the chairs, with everything else in this room, to bring me these colors. And whilst it's doing that, it still remains colorless, transcendent. So it's like Hashem Himself is projecting kindness, projecting wisdom through these vessels of kindness, wisdom, and so on, through the spheres, and yet He remains unchanged as He projects through them. Because He acts through them, but He isn't them. Right? That's where we left off. And then last week we started to discuss, okay, so where did they come from? Where do these actual vessels come from? These definitions, where did they come from? That's what we started to discuss. So all we're saying about God is that He uses these vessels and is unchanged by them. Okay, but where did the vessels come from? So we started explaining that the Chassidus introduces this word, Elokut, in English, godly, getlich, he writes in Yiddish, which means not God, but godly. That is to say, Hashem Himself, these are the words we're using, and again, we'll get more language for that going forward. God Himself, the light expresses God's uncontained self, and therefore it's non-defined, and the definitions are God containing Himself into these definitions. So we cannot say they are God, but they are godly, because He contained Himself in these definitions. Which is why these definitions can actually interact with the undefined light, because in essence they're really God. They're really godly. Right? The way we explained it yesterday was, the light would say, this is God. The vessels would say, this is God's wisdom. So it adds a little word afterwards, this definition, but it doesn't describe a self. It doesn't say, I am wisdom. It says, this is God's wisdom. That's what the Keli says. The Keli of Chachma says, this is God's wisdom. So it doesn't have independence. It's not an independent being, like he said, like an axe being held by the wood chopper, who's totally subservient to the wood chopper, but still an independent existence. That's not true of the vessel of Chachma. Good morning. Good morning. That's not true of the vessel of Chachma. The vessel of Chachma is not an independent tool that God uses. It is godly. Right? So we need to get more language to understand what this means. Something that's godly has definition, but it's not God Himself. That's what we're trying to struggle with, to understand what that means, which will help us understand where these kalim, where these vessels come from, where these definitions come from. This is where we are. Correct. Okay. It's godly, not God. We have to understand what that means exactly. But we're getting a little bit closer in that Hashem contains Himself in these definitions, and therefore they do not declare themselves as hi, I am wisdom. They would say, hi, this is God's wisdom. So there's a definition, but it's a godly definition, not a self-declaring definition, as I would be. The first thing I say is, I'm here. I'm smart. I'm kind. I. That's what I would say. The Kalim of Atzilus don't say that. The vessels don't say that. The vessels would say, this is God's kindness. Okay? So it's godly, not God. So you have to get the better words for this. That's where we are. Okay. So let's go to the left-hand side, and we'll go to the third line in the Hebrew where it says v'lazois. V'lazois, and therefore, because these definitions are not inherent, independent beings, they are godly beings. So they are defined, but they're godly definitions. V'lazois, therefore, ha'or ha'pashat. Therefore, it's possible for the unfiltered, non-defined light mislabish b'sech hakelim to be invested in those very vessels. The reason why God's undefined projection can actually use these tools is because these tools are not independent. These tools are godly. If the tools were independent, then they would not be able to exist in the face of the non-defined godly. The only reason why these definitions can actually interact with the non-defined godly is because they are godly themselves, even though they're defined. Okay? Again, we'll get more language for this. And therefore the godly light, the godly energy can act through these vessels because they themselves don't see themselves as independent. They're godly. Va'az, and it's here in the interaction between the non-defined godly and the defined godly. Shayach Lemar, of this we can say, Masha Kasav Rambam, that which Rambam writes, Shehu Yadeya v'Adeya Atzma v'Yadua. He is the knower, he is the known, and he is the knowledge itself. Now we can say that all the godly elements interact with each other in absolute union. The undefined godly interacts with the defined godly wisdom in absolute union. That's where we would say Rambam position.
So in that realm, it's he is God, he is godly.
He is the known, he is the knower, and he's the knowledge.
Okay, we're talking about knowledge.
Right? Exactly, because God himself, we're sticking with moral, is beyond all definition. But once the godly light invests itself to become one with the godly definitions of wisdom and kindness, now we can say God's one with these. Now we can say that God's one with his knowledge. Right? Because all the elements are godly. It's godly light that's non-defined, and it's godly vessels that are defined, unless they all interact in absolute union. Clear on this? We'll get more language for this, but we clear on the essence of this? Okay. Ki, because the light becomes one with the vessel. Godly light with a godly vessel. B'yichud atzav nifla, in an absolute and most intense union. Wondrous. Nifla means wondrous. To the point that they become like one entity. It's hard to know what this is, one entity. But it doesn't give this example here, but elsewhere in Chassidus it explains what this looks like, this becoming one entity. So, one way to think about it, it's not a perfect example because there are no perfect examples for God's absolute oneness. But to give a sense for what it means, that two things become one idea. And again, it's the same thing as Ur and Keli, light and vessel. Words are vessels, and ideas are light, or a feeling. So if I want to express an idea to you, which is what I'm doing right now, good morning, I'm expressing a concept, and I'm trying to find words, putting the concept into words, and then delivering it to you, right? So what you're getting is a bunch of vessels, but the vessels contain some content that contain a light, and hopefully you know English, and you're capable of deciphering from the vessels, from the words, the content, the idea that's inside of it, right? But it's not as if somewhere in any of our experiences, the idea is separated from the words. We experience them as one. Even in my own mind, the ideas and the words exist as one entity in my head. Even though we understand, at least conceptually, that there's the idea and the words and they're not the same. But they become so unified that they're one. The ideas and the words are almost indistinguishable. Case in point, try telling me the idea without words. You can't. Or try telling yourself the idea without words. Still can't. Even though you understand that the idea is not the words. The words are just the container to contain the
words in here, not the words that I say.
Any of them.
Because the words I say are not always my idea.
So they're more materialistic. They're less, it's a lavosh achitzin, it's an external vessel. But nonetheless, it's still very difficult, even in the words that I'm projecting now, to separate the idea from the words. And the moment you did, you're just finding new words. Right? Because you can't have an oy without a keli. And you can't have a keli without an ur.
You can't have an or without a keli?
Very difficult, because otherwise you can't experience it. You can't experience it, right? Try to experience light without the light bouncing off something to bring you the color. Can't. Right? You can't have an ur without a keli. You can't experience it. Right? So that's why they become one. Like the color that's coming to my eyes, one with the light. In the same way. Right? Because ur and keli will always become one. Yeah. So that's not a perfect example, but it gives us a better sense of this idea that the ur, the light, and the keli, the vessel, can become one. That's only true if the light and vessel are of the same, let's say, substance, of the same essence, of the same truth. Right? The light of my ideas are not going to come onto the keli of the table. The physical light from the light bulb will come onto the keli of the table, but the light of my ideas will only come into the keli of a word, because that's commensurate to ideas. So if the ur and keli are going to become one, they have to be of the same essence. And therefore, the godly light can interact with the godly vessels. But only because the vessels are godly. If the vessels were not godly, if they were independent beings, they could never unite. You clear? Okay. So here's when we say Rambam's contention that God is absolutely one with his knowledge, when the light and the vessel interact. Godly light interacts with godly vessel, and then they become one. And this is what he explains. The Haamonas means to say, so 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 lines up from the bottom. The Haamonas is to say, the element of knowledge with which he knows, with the absolute non-defined light, which is now animating and invested in the knower, who echad mamash achdas gomor, is absolutely one in a perfect union. And he's also the known. The davar zeh, and as Rambam says it, this matter, the mouth cannot say it, and no heart can properly understand it thoroughly, because we are limited in that, because again, we are a comprised unity, and we're looking at absolute unity, so we don't know what that looks like. We can never properly understand what it means to have this kind of union. Just as God's essence is beyond comprehension, which we explained way back a couple of weeks ago, that you can only understand things using the measuring sticks that it itself exists. So you weigh things that are heavy, you weigh with pounds and I don't know what's equal, kilos, thank you. And ideas you measure against how well you understand them, and feelings you measure against how well you feel them. And how do you measure God's existence? Not using any of those tools, because all those tools are created, right? So, just as his essence is beyond knowing, because knowing is a creation, so it is equally impossible to understand how this essence is one with the vessels. This is something we spoke about in Shari Yichud V'Amunah, where we learned it back when, that in the same way God's very self is beyond comprehension, his interaction and his becoming one with definition is also beyond comprehension. Right? Let me put it a different way. I know what knowledge is, I know what information is, I know what ideas are, and I know what tables are. So I understand that ideas and tables don't go together. Ideas and words go together, because I know what words are, and I know what ideas, and I know how they come together. Right? But if I don't know what God is in himself, I cannot know how that becomes one with anything, because I don't know it. So if God's essence is beyond comprehension, then his becoming one with knowledge is also incomprehensible. I can only accept or reject the union of two things if I understand both elements. Then I could say either it goes together or it doesn't go together. Right? Water goes into cups, not into napkins. Or does maybe into napkins, whatever. It doesn't belong in there. But because I understand both these elements, and I can say that they belong together or not. But if I don't understand God's essence because it's beyond knowability, then I cannot say, oh, no, you can't become one with knowledge. We said so. I don't know what it is to say that it cannot become one with knowledge. So if I don't know it, I cannot know the manner in which it becomes one with knowledge, with kindness, with any of the other vessels. Clear? Okay. Therefore, fourth paragraph. On the right-hand side, you're turning 2 pages from the centerfold. Therefore, the 10 spheres are referred to as Raza Demnem Nusa, the secret of faith, or the mystery of faith. It's to accept its truth beyond comprehension. In the same way we explained back that faith does not mean that, I don't understand, shut the brain off and just accept. But it means I'm pushing the limits of what I can possibly understand and understanding that God's beyond that. So if I push the limits of what exists and I appreciate that God's beyond definition, so I have to accept that this is beyond, the same thing is true of the divine spheres. I push the limits of what I can possibly understand as things that become one, and I understand that God's beyond that because He is beyond that, therefore His oneness is going to be beyond that. So the same faith that's applied to God's truth Himself is applied to the fact that God becomes one with these definitions. Okay. This is the element of faith that goes beyond comprehension as well. And this is when we say, in this regard, it's correct to say Rambam's contention that God is one with God is the knower, the known, etc. Meaning to say, not like those who have suggested that the vessels of the 10 attributes, they are independent beings of God. Kamaya Garzan, like axe. Right, we had two views about the relation about the light versus the vessel. There were those who said, "Oh, the spheres are the vessels; God's beyond that, and the spheres, the attributes, are just like a tool that God uses to create things." But saying that it's a tool to create things gives it a sense of independence, like an axe is independent from the one who wields it. It's subservient to the one who wields it, but it's still an independent being. If that's what we were going to say, then God's oneness is not absolute with the vessel, because the vessel is independent of Him, and that's not true. The vessels are not independent of Him, even though they aren't Him. Right? Because they're godly, not God. Right? Elokus, but rather these vessels themselves are godly. And the non-defined, transcendent light and energy become one with those vessels as explained above in absolute oneness. However, God's essence, which is beyond being invested in the vessels, is way beyond all of this, even beyond being invested in the vessels. Okay. Is this clear so far? It's somewhat of a recap so far, but hopefully we're clear. If there's anything not clear, please let me know and we'll try to clarify. Clear so far? Okay. Now the Matzah gets to the next point, which is like this. This explains what creates and what gives energy to whatever exists in this world. So Hashem Himself, not defined, He gives energy into this world. Right? Is there wisdom in this world? So what's the interaction between God Himself and that wisdom that's in this world? Is wisdom a creation and God animates it the same way He's animating the cup? Or is God animating this world with wisdom? Both. Take the second point. He's animating this world with wisdom, right? Which means the wisdom that's in here is, the wisdom that's in this world is the animator of this world, but it's not separate from God. Now we have the answer. Considering that wisdom, it's the divine wisdom is godly. It's not a tool that God uses. If it was a tool that God uses, that means God's standing outside the world and He uses a tool He created called wisdom to inject into the world. But that wisdom in this world is not godly at all. But now that we understand that the vessels themselves are godly, so whatever is projected into this world is God's projection. The wisdom in this world is not a separate wisdom, it's God's wisdom that's in this world. Because wisdom itself is one with God Himself.
But it's not God's wisdom.
It's godly. Correct, it's godly wisdom. And thus it's not a separate entity that's injected in this world to give it wisdom, kindness, whatever else exists in this world. Whatever else exists in this world to animate it is not a separate entity from Him that He wields to create our world. It's actually Him in there. Because it's godly wisdom, it's godly kindness, it's godly strength. Right? Okay, so now He's going to give us Kabbalistic language to that. Right? Therefore, Mavor Be'etz Chaim, the fourth to last paragraph. It's explained in the Eitz Chaim, which is the primary work of the Arizal, with the Arizal student recording the Arizal's teachings. Shekelim Datzilus, that the vessels of Atzilus, the vessels of the world of Atzilus, which is the world of oneness with God, Nasim L'Shama L'Bri Yitzir Asira, they become the soul, the life force of the lower worlds, the created world, the formed world, and the doing world, which is our world. Lahach is to give it life. Ma'ayin Lash, bringing our world from something into nothing. Bringing it into being from nothing into something. Nevrayim Abalikvul, limited, created beings as we know them. How is that possible? How could Chachma be the creator? Answer, Elokus Kinisker. Because wisdom itself is godly wisdom. So it's not creating because of wisdom, it's creating because it's godly wisdom. Because it's godly kindness, therefore can create. Kindness itself cannot create anything. Godly kindness can create. And therefore the kindness, the wisdom, and anything else can become the actual life force of our world, or any worlds, because they are godly.
These words that we're using are just our perspective.
To a large degree. But it shouldn't... Okay, you know what? Actually, that's precisely the next word. So let's read. Because you're literally going to get into the definitions that we use. Okay, very good.
I was also going to just ask, like,
Yeah.
you're still saying, I don't know, I'm stuck on the point, but like, wisdom. I know it's godly wisdom.
Yep.
But it's still...
It's still wisdom. It's still not God himself. Very good. And I mentioned part 2 is going to give us more language for that. Version 2 is going to give us more language for that.
Okay.
But at least now we're getting the fact. Right? That it's not a separate entity that God's using to create, but that these themselves are godly entities. And then he uses them to create.
Okay.
Okay?
So the Kalim is the wisdom?
Correct. Wisdom.
Kalim of Atzilus specifically.
Could say Kalim of Atzilus, correct. Correct. Okay. So now let's read and get to the point here about how we describe these things, the words we use. So Vizehu Perush on the left-hand side, above, the bottom of the page has a V, and then above. Vizehu Perush HaTorah Shenikra Hu Yisbarach. This is the meaning of the various different definitions we give of God. Chacham, we call him wise. The Chassid, we call him gracious. Shebchinas HaChachma, the element of wisdom, he kliya Chachma Atzilus, is the vessel of Chachma, of Atzilus, of wisdom and Atzilus. She Elokus, which is godly. V'chein HaChesed, and likewise, the kindness is kliya Chesed, is the vessel of Chesed, of kindness, in that world of Atzilus. Amna Mashahu Atzmusa Yisbarach, but that which we say of God's essence, which is way beyond the whole definitions of godly, of wisdom. Nikra Chacham, we still call that Chacham. It's not as if we're calling the vessel wise. We're calling God wise. So how do we call God wise or God kind if he's beyond the definitions? Right? Hainu, this is, it's because he himself becomes one with the element of Chachma. And thus I can call him kind and him wise, because he has chosen to put himself into those definitions. And therefore I can call him wise. Even though it's simultaneously true to say he's beyond all these definitions. Sha'az hu mischakim behem, because then he becomes wise through them, because they are godly. And he knows creation through knowledge. He knows creation through knowledge, as mentioned above, even though he himself is beyond all these things. Which takes us back to way back when we spoke about this. When we say in davening, Ata Gibar, you're strong, you're this, you're that, are we lying? Are we saying the truth or not? Because if we're saying the truth, we're limiting God. And if we're not saying the truth, then what are we saying? Right? So now we're pushing at is that it's both true and not the whole truth. It's true that God is kind because he chose to be kind, and he invests himself in that godly definition. He created a godly definition that he's invested in. And if we can say of him, you're kind, you're wise, and so on and so forth. And yet it's still simultaneously true to say you are beyond all of those things. If you want to see it in the words of prayer, Chassidus explains this elsewhere. Every single bracha has this. The first 4 words. Actually more. Baruch Ata Hashem, that's 3. Elokeinu 4. Melech HaOlam, 6 words. Those 6 words. So the word Baruch, we translate as bless. Chassidus translate the word Baruch to mean to draw down. As a blessing is to draw something down. Okay, so Baruch, we're drawing upon. What are we drawing upon? Ata, you. When I say you, no definition. Not at all. Just you. And you are Hashem. You are transcendent. Elokeinu, you are our God. That's not transcendent anymore. That's our God. You're invested in the definitions of wise, kind, and so on. So I'm drawing upon you, who is transcendent, who is invested in definition. Melech HaOlam is therefore king of the world. But it's the same Ata, it's the same you that I'm drawing upon into all these levels. Because all of these are godly, and thus you are found in all of them. So I talk to you beyond definition, and then I start giving definition. Because it's Baruch, I'm drawing upon you into all these definitions. Well, that's how it's expressed in prayer. And thus you can say all these definitions. After you've said Ata. Once you say you, then I can say you are invested in kindness. You are invested in wisdom, and so on and so forth. And it's not a lie anymore. It's true. Because you have invested yourself in these things. Because these things are godly as you made them. Okay, so now...
I have a question.
Yeah.
What is Atzilus? What's the definition?
So the word Atzilus literally means... Okay, very good question. The word Atzilus literally means emanations. So it's the highest of four worlds in the Kabbalistic geography. And as opposed to the worlds that come afterwards, which he mentioned afterwards, Beriya, Yetzira, and Asiya, where you mentioned those words. Yeah, earlier he mentioned those titles. Those are other worlds. Those three worlds, the lower ones, Beriya, Yetzira, and Asiya, which mean creation, formation, and action, those three worlds are worlds in which what exists feels independent and is observing God on one level or another. In our world, we barely observe God. We try to find him. And in higher worlds, where angels are, they're observing God all day. But they're still independent. At least they feel independent and they're observing God. Whereas the world of Atzilus is a world of emanation. It's not a creation yet. It just emanates from him. So it's not a world in which there's entities that observe him. It's the world that itself is godly. So these vessels we're describing before, there's godly wisdom, that's the world of Atzilus. And it just emanates from him rather than created by him. So they have definition, yes, but the definitions are godly definitions. It's here is God's wisdom, here is God's kindness. As opposed to the next world would be like, I'm here, and oh wow, God's kindness is really nice. That would be our world. Right? Because we feel that sense of independence. Okay. So now the bottom of the page you see a V. V meaning 5th chapter. So in the first version, we've just concluded chapter 4, and we're about to begin chapter 5. So go back to if you turn from the front, you turn the page 3 times. 1, 2, 3. You'll see in the bottom it says Mahadura Kama. It's the beginning. Turn right. Turn 3 pages. From the beginning. From the beginning. Start from the beginning. Turn 3 pages in. On the right-hand side, on the bottom, you'll see it says Mahadura Kama, which means first version. That's what we just learned.
Oh.
So the first version goes through into the middle of chapter 5, and then it switches to the updated version, the second version that the author wrote, and then from there it goes to chapter 5 as well. So we're going to skip these few lines that begin chapter 5 in the first version, go straight to the second version of chapter 4. So it's going to be a review, but this time a lot more words, at least for this last point of something being godly while still retaining a definition, while still retaining godly, which is like the biggest contradiction. The world of Atzilus is the biggest enigma. Our world, which observes God, great. We're here, God's there, we look at it. God himself, fantastic. He's perfect, he's undefined. But then when you give us this middle ground where there's like a world that's godly but also has definition, it's much more difficult to understand. So that we'll have much more words for in version 2. So we're going to skip and turn 1 page on the left-hand side where it says Madura Basra, second version. So this second version is taking us back to the discussion of Maharal. And verses... Same author.
He just rewrote it?
Yes. He wrote this at a very young age. From, not my estimation, based on scholarly research, it's somewhere between the ages of 14 and 25.
Wow.
That he wrote this, something like that.
And then he rewrote it in 24?
He must have, yeah. We know this because we know when he started writing. Maybe he's younger than 14, but we know when he started writing at a very young age. And we know that his grandfather, the Alter Rebbe, commented on it, which means it was written before his grandfather passed away. I mean, how old he was when his grandfather passed away. So somewhere in that time frame is when he wrote it, which is a very, very young man, very young age. Yeah. Just unless he didn't feel intimidated by this yet. I was talking about a Rebbe, but...
He was a real guy.
Sorry?
He
Yeah,
was a
these
real
are...
huge guy.
Yeah. Okay, so this is Madura Basra, version 2 of the chapter we just read, and it's taking us back to the opinion of Maharal versus the Rambam. And again, Maharal was of the view, how dare you say God is one with his knowledge, you're making God into a knower, God's beyond definition. That was Maharal. Right? That was Maharal's position. So we're going from there. Kolemar, meaning to say, this is Maharal's view. Just as God does the action of knowing, that he knows creation, and the whole idea of knowledge is itself a created thing. Just as God made physical things. Right? Maharal would say, God's beyond definition. As for God knowing, God doing, same thing. They're all just actions that are completely detached from him, which we already rejected because we said these knowing is not detached, they're godly. But Maharal didn't say that. Maharal's of the view, detached little things that he's doing, he knows, he does, all the same thing, detached from him. Completely. Right? So just as he made the physical body of created beings, he created something called knowledge. Right? And therefore, continue. Just as multiple creations. Do not mean that he has to be multiple, just because he's doing multiple creations. Because multiple activities does not mean that the doer has to have multiplicity. Just because my hand does lots of actions doesn't mean I have multiple hands. It's one hand doing lots of actions. Great. So God does lots of actions, knows lots of things. He's still one, because knowledge and doing are just actions. Right? For reasons that each of the philosophers has given on their own, but the bottom line is that multiple doing does not necessitate a multiple doer. And therefore the knowledge itself is also multiple activities that don't require him to be multiple. Do not require that he himself is multiple, God forbid. Because knowledge itself is a creation and an activity that he does, not something that he is. As opposed to us, we are comprised of our knowledge, of our feelings. We have an essence, which we spoke about, but at least my personality certainly is made up of all the things I know and all the things I feel. That's not true for God. Knowing, feeling, it's all just activities, and therefore multiple activities don't change him in the slightest. This is Maharal's position. And therefore, considering this, according to Maharal, we could not apply Rambam's position that through knowing himself he knows all creation. That's what Rambam said. Rambam said because he's one with his knowledge, therefore by knowing himself he knows everything, because he's one with knowledge. Right? We wouldn't say that according to the Maharal. This is not true according to the Maharal. His knowing of himself is not to be considered knowledge at all, because knowledge is an activity. And according to Maharal, knowledge is an activity, and therefore knowing himself is not the knowing that we have. Knowing creation, that's an activity. Knowing himself, something separate entirely. Whereas according to Rambam, God's knowing himself is knowing creation because he's one with his knowledge. Clear the difference? Yeah? But according to Maharal, he is beyond the whole notion of knowledge, and therefore the knowledge he has of himself is not to be confused with knowledge as we know it, because he's beyond any definition. And therefore, and that which he knows creation, is literal knowledge. But and yet, there is still no question upon us, how could his knowledge not contradict his singularity? Because knowledge is an activity that's separate from him according to Maharal, right? The Rambam was compelled to say that God is one with his knowledge in order to prevent the question of how can multiple knowledges and multiple creations would seemingly cause a multiplicity in him, himself. And therefore he says, he's one with his knowledge, and by knowing himself he knows everything. Right? So when Rambam is presented with the question of how could God's multiple knowledge not change his oneness, answer, because he's one with his knowledge. He knows himself, knows all. So it's one singular knowledge. It's one singular knowledge. He knows himself. And that knowing himself includes trillions of things because he's one with all of it. Right? But that only follows Rambam's view that the knowledge is himself. And because the knowledge is himself, he must say that he's one with everything he knows. Otherwise we'd have multiplicity. Right? If he wasn't one with his knowledge, and he is knowledge, that would mean, God forbid, that he has multiplicity. That would mean he himself has multiplicity, God forbid. Because considering the fact that he himself is knowledge, according to Rambam. And therefore Rambam says, by knowing himself, he knows all creations, and therefore there's no contradiction, because it's all one knowledge himself. Right? That's Rambam's view. But considering that we've just established, according to Maharal, he is not knowledge. Knowledge is just another creation. Therefore, the multiple knowledges do not mean that he has multiplicity, God forbid, because knowledge is just another activity he does. It's possible he knows that he knows every single created being, and the knowledge of each creation is different than the knowledge of the other, and not that he knows all things by one knowing. Right? Rambam says he knows all things by one knowing. He knows himself, he knows all, because it's all one with him. That's only because, in Rambam's view, God is knowledge. And if God is knowledge, the only way to maintain multiple knowledge and be singular is if you are one with the knowledge. Only if your starting point is, he is knowledge. But according to Maharal, where the starting point is, God is not knowledge. He's beyond knowledge. Knowledge is just a tool. Great. So multiple tools, multiple knowledges, multiple activities, still doesn't change his singularity. Because he is not knowledge. And therefore every piece of information he knows, separate piece of information. Not one singular knowledge. And yet doesn't contradict his singularity, because he is not knowledge. He's just a tool.
What's new about this?
It's not. It's the second version reviewing
Okay.
what we already did, right? So that's why I said it's going to be quite a review. But I'm moving a little bit fast because we know all this already. And I want to get to the main point, which maybe we'll get to next week, but we'll try to get there, which is more words for this idea of godly. Because that is going to come up in the second version, if not in the first version. So we're moving towards that. Okay? So, Veriba Hayadias, and the many different knowledges, the multiple knowledge that God has, according to Maharal, because he's beyond them. Himpriyat Varam Rabim is just a creation of many different entities, because knowledge itself is a creation. The knowledge of each thing is another creation. Just as each individual created body in this world is an individual creation. And just because God created multiple bodies, it does not mean multiplicity for God. So too, God created multiple pieces of information, and they're all just created things that don't change his singularity because he's beyond all of it. Yeah? Okay, well, this is something we're familiar with already. Top of the next page, we call all of this. This is the explanation of the Maharal's approach, the genius, the Gaon, the Talmidav and his student, Tosfos Yom Tov, the author of the book called Tosfos Yom Tov. Okay, how much time do we have? Because he's about to get to the analogy.
10 minutes?
10 minutes? Okay. Even though it's very true, in that Maharal suggested that God is beyond knowledge, true. Because God is beyond all definition, certainly the definitions of knowledge as explained above at length. And therefore, the distance between God and physical creation is equal to the distance between God and knowledge. They're both not, we spoke about this before, they're both not measures by which you can measure God. You cannot measure God by physical measure, and you cannot measure God by intellectual measure. They're both equally distant from his infinitude. That is true. As the verse reads, you made all of it with wisdom, meaning, because wisdom, chachma, and physical deed equal to you, and therefore you did all with wisdom. Nonetheless, yet it is not true to say, says Samach Tzaddik, and this is the main point, to say that knowledge is a separate entity. Even though it's true. Oh, sorry, you want to say something?
No, I'm saying you're only using knowledge as an example, right?
Yes, knowledge is just an example. The same thing applies to kindness. Correct. Yes, the reason why we're using knowledge is because knowledge, kindness, and everything else is projection outward. It's easier to understand how those are separate. Whereas knowledge is coming inward. Oh my gosh, you're changing yourself because you're taking in information.
Like what we learned before, like the source isn't what the rays are in the sun. Like that's what I'm like just imagining.
That's right, because that's Chassidus already, which is what he's getting to, right? Yes, correct. Okay. So we're going to accept Maharal, that God is beyond definition, but we are not going to accept Maharal when he says that knowledge is a separate activity, separate from him. That we're not going to accept, because the knowledge is godly, as we explained, and now let's get some words for that. Nonetheless, even though it's true that God is beyond the definitions of knowledge, we are not going to accept the proposition that knowledge is a separate entity like any other action. Just as physical created bodies are separate from God. Not true. As far as this goes, Elokus mamish. Knowledge, God's knowledge, is called godly, even if it isn't God. Meaning to say, it's his knowledge. It's not like some other action that he just does that's separate from him. No, it's his knowledge. Because it's he himself who knows. Okay, now let's get an analogy. What's an analogy for something that is not separate from me and yet isn't the full me? Right? That's what we're trying to get to. God's wisdom is godly, but it's not God.
Feelings.
So feelings I have are kind of like that, and he's going to give an example for that. We're going to see really how this works.
Like a body. The whole body
Sorry?
and then a specific body part. No.
Yeah, we used that analogy, I think, once before, right? Kamoya Derech Mashal, by way of example, second to last line. Harav, a teacher, a true teacher, true master. Shemasbal Atmai, that lowers himself, Lischakim, to share wisdom in Tinukotim with a young little baby, young child, Lefias Galasai, commensurate to his level of understanding. So a math professor teaches 1 + 1 = 2 to a 5-year-old. Is that information not him? Is that not his information? It is. It's just not the complete totality of it. It would be wrong to say that he's teaching some other information. No, it's his information. It's just condensed for a little kid. So it's not the whole thing, but it's still his.
I remember this example. We used this example before. Did we not?
If I did, it's because I took it from here.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, that's possible I did.
It's not the teacher's information, it's oral, it's like, no.
Right, I mean, but in the sense that the teacher is truly teaching the kid,
Okay.
even though it's not a reflection of his entire knowledge.
Based on the kids.
Based on the kid's level. So he has to lower himself to the level of a 2-year-old and see how can he explain to a 2-year-old 1 + 1 = 2. So you gotta take 2 grapes, here's 1 grape, here's another grape, here's 2. That's his information. He's sharing his own information, but that's not the totality of it at all. Here. So Sha'az, Sha'af Pikain, and nonetheless, even though it's so tiny, Tzimtzum Askalas Harav Oz, Ein B'chinas Nifrad, this condensed information that is given to the child is not separate from him. V'hu mamash etzel elash tzimtzum atzmai. It's he himself that is there, just happens to be contracted and condensed. So there is an example of this idea that there is an entity who condenses itself to express itself in a certain way, and yet that certain way that it expresses himself, where he truly is there, does not define the whole him. It's truly this math professor teaching the math, but it's not the totality of his math skill at all. Clear?
So we're the kid?
Yeah. Well, actually, not we. Chachma Vatzilus is the kid. Divine wisdom is the kid. Because God himself is beyond definition. And he's condensing himself to have a definition called wisdom. So even though it's condensed and it's not the totality of him, it's still him there.
Is this the same wisdom as the Rambam talks about?
Yes, that's what he's saying. That's the reconciliation that Chassidus is offering between Maharal and Rambam. That it's true on the one hand to say that God's beyond all definition, and it's still true to say that God's one with his wisdom. But only once God condenses himself to be in wisdom. Because Maharal in the pure sense is, it's not God in the wisdom, it's just a tool. Rambam in pure sense is, the totality of God is in the wisdom. And Chassidus is straddling both. The totality of God is beyond definition, and yet it's still him in the wisdom.
So when we talk about the professor and all his wisdom, that's God in his totality, meaning his
Correct,
wisdom.
in the analogy.
And then
The way he is in Chachma is a little sliver of 1 + 1 = 2 that he's condensing himself to share. Clear?
The condensing is
The defined spheres.
like yeah.
Correct. To give himself definition. It's still him there, even if it's not the totality of him. Elsewhere, he gives another example. Okay, this is not exactly the same thing, but it'll help us. The Alter Rebbe gives an example of someone who memorized, memorized the whole tractate of Talmud, right? And now he's learning another tractate. Right? So where did that tractate go that he learned by heart? It's still there in his brain completely, fully. He's just not invested in that right now. But it's still true that it's there. Right? So it's still true that God's infinite is there, even if right now what it's condensed in is this particular thing. But it's still true that there is this essential, infinite essence truth that's beyond what he's invested right now. Clear? Okay. So God willing, next week we'll continue with this analogy. He's going to explain how the analogy is not perfect. It's not a perfect analogy because in the analogy, it's math. Just math at a higher level, math at a lower level. Whereas with God, it's non-definition and definition. But I'll still explain yet why it works and how it's similar and how it's dissimilar, which will give us more language for this notion that you have godly definitions, and yet they're not God himself. But it's still true to say that it's you in that kindness, and it's you in that wisdom. And therefore we're not lying in our prayer. It's true. It's you being kind to us, not some tool that you're using called kindness, which is what Maharal would say.
and when we say you, we're alluding to the source of
The essence that's
Not
beyond
just the
definition.
kindness we're talking
Correct.
about.
Yeah.
The Ata, the you. Right. Do you want to say something? Sorry.
This is still all in Atzilus. I
It's
don't see
all in
how
Atzilus,
I don't
yes.
see it's like it hasn't come down
But
yet.
Atzilus is the way God projects. That's what he mentioned from Narizal, that the wisdom of Atzilus becomes the life force of our world. And the wisdom of the kindness of Atzilus becomes the life force of our world. Because it's you being kind to us through kindness of Atzilus. It's you being wise for the wisdom of Atzilus and so on.
We're trying to understand Atzilus.
We're trying to understand how Atzilus. Understanding Atzilus is the most important component in understanding that God has an intimate relationship with us. Because if we don't have Atzilus, either you're like Rambam, just defined as wisdom, and then it's not truly transcendent, or like Maharal, you're so transcendent that everything you interact with is just a tool you're using. But because there's something called Atzilus, because there's an interface, there's a place where you become wise, where you become kind, now I have an actual relationship with you. Because when you're kind to me, it's really you. And when I understand something about you, it's really you. And yet, you're not defined by any of those things I know, or any of the kindness I receive. So without Atzilus, there's no real relationship between us and the truth of God's transcendence.
And that's the mitzvah, to know Hashem.
It's the mitzvah of knowing Hashem. Right, exactly. So knowing Hashem is knowing His knowledge, knowing His kindness. And it's truly Him. And the faith is, you're beyond all that. And it's the same you in both of those. One that I can grasp and one that I just can't. But it's still the same one you. Right? Just to conclude with a little story from the Alter Rebbe. And the Tzemach Tzedek, the author. So the author of the Tzemach Tzedek was a young child. He grew up in his grandfather's house. His mother died when he was very young. So he grew up in his grandfather's house. And one day, it doesn't say how old the Alter Rebbe was, but it seems like he was, Tzemach Tzedek, the author, it seems like he was 2, 3, 4 years old, little kid. And the grandfather of the Alter Rebbe asks his grandson, Tzemach Tzedek, where is Zayda? Where's grandfather? So the kid points. And the finger is pointing at his beard. So he says, no, that's not Zayda, that's Zayda's beard. And then he points somewhere else. He says, well, that's Zayda's nose. Points somewhere else, that's Zayda's eyes. But where's Zayda? Okay, the kid, goes off to play as if, giving up. But then, at some point, the kid, maybe a door closing his finger or something, he hurt himself, and he screams out, Zayda! And the grandfather turns around, and the grandkid says, that was Zayda. Right? Because I'm not pointing anything in particular, I'm talking to you. Right? But this is the point. There's the you, and then there's your beard, your eyes. So there's you, and then there's Ata, and then there is your kindness, your wisdom. But it's still you in the wisdom. It's still you in the kindness. That's somebody else. It's the same you. Even though I acknowledge that you are beyond all of it. Okay, so more words for that, God willing, coming. Next week, Tuesday, is actually Yutus Kislev. Okay, so we'll learn. Okay, have a wonderful day, everybody.
Thank you so much.